Okay, right, here we go. So I want to respond, a bit old school this, to one of these 10 questions for atheists type things. This one is from a channel, Trinity Radio, and a host called Braxton Hunter. That's a good old American name, that, isn't it? I think there's 60 odd million people in the UK. I doubt there's a single person in the UK with a name like Braxton Hunter. I think you've got to be American to have a name like that. So he's given these 10 things. I know that I am not the first person to respond to this because I came across this list because I came across a video where he compiled some of the responses, including from people like Godless Engineer and Shannon Q. So what I have done is I have not watched that video yet. I paused it before I got to their actual responses and thought, let's go and have a look at the 10 questions myself. I liked the 10 questions. I wanted to respond to them. So that is what I plan to do here. Okay, so here is Braxton giving the first of his 10 questions.
What facts about reality that you and I agree are real facts about the way the world is does your worldview account for, but my Christianity doesn't account for, or at least doesn't account for well? And for those of you that would point out atheism isn't a worldview, I'm talking about your worldview that includes atheism. I can't think of any. Christianity accounts for evil, suffering, the existence of other religions, including supernatural events in those other religions, science, and differences among different denominations of Christianity. But I can think of many things that the most common worldviews that include atheism don't answer as well as I think Christianity does. Like universal supernatural claims, universal religious experiences, free will, morality, near-death experiences, beauty, the rapid expansion of the early church, the events surrounding the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, and our shared longing for purpose and meaning. So what is it that Christianity doesn't answer as well as your worldview?
Okay, so that was a little bit more than a question. It sort of got into quite a long statement there. But the question that he was asking is, what does he think that an atheist worldview, and that's a language that I don't mind. I think if you start talking about the atheist worldview, then I have some problems with that. But what would be better explained by an atheist worldview than a theistic, typically Christian worldview? I won't give too many comments on the things that he listed there that he believes that Christianity explains better, other than to say he talks about supernatural events. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? It's a real kick in the teeth that all like the big, decent, supernatural events all seem to mysteriously always have happened a long time in the past, just before we had the chance to properly document and investigate them. Bastard. Such a shame that, isn't it? That now we have the tools to document and record and investigate these things, they just don't seem to happen anymore. It's just the same as sailors, isn't it, with these sea monsters. They used to paint paintings and write tales about these things. There were mermaids, there were sirens summoning them onto the rocks, there were krakens and sort of big sort of giant squid type things that would drag their boats under the water. And now that we actually have the chance to record these things and investigate them, sailors just don't seem to stumble across these things anymore, do they? What's the chances of that? You know, it's really unfortunate, that, I think. But what I want to do is, let me say there are two sort of candidates that I had for this. I know that a lot of people would probably go with sort of something along the lines of the problem of evil and trying to explain that in the context of an omnibenevolent deity. I know the typical Christian response to that, and I always found that a more sort of difficult to deal with version of that really is the problem of suffering when it comes to natural disasters. I think that's kind of hard to square with a typical Christian conceptualization of God as omnibenevolent, assuming omnibenevolent looks kind of how we would expect it to look, right, and not something that's rather horrific. It seems odd to me, as somebody who isn't omnibenevolent but regards themselves as reasonably benevolent, that you could stand there as some omnipotent, sentient agent and observe a tsunami, a tidal wave, such as there was back in sort of, was it 2003, 2004, in the Indian Ocean, knowing that that is going to kill nearly 250,000 people and you don't do anything. Right. you have the ability to plant the thought in their brain. You don't even have to reveal yourself. Just plant the thought in their brain. Go inland and visit a relative or a friend 10 or 15 miles inland for a day or two, right? But instead, absolute inaction. If I had the chance to do that, and I didn't do that, I know that I would be regarded as a moral monster. But we have this kind of thing that Christianity loves to do, I think, which is to sort of play fast and loose. If a child is found in the rubble miraculously a week after a building's collapsed, that's a sign of God's benevolence that he saved the child. But if you're just about to reach out to the child to lift it out the rubble, and a concrete lintel drops down and explodes its head like a watermelon, right, then well, obviously this is issues beyond our ken. How can our mere human mortal finite brains understand God's decision making? There must be something more that we don't understand that would explain it. So you kind of won both ways with that, and that's the story, I think, of Christianity. It's one of the points that's made it so successful, I think, is that it's so amorphous, and it's been so amenable to change in ways when it's had to. A lot of the Christians today would probably be burnt at the stake 500 years ago for their sort of heterodox, unacceptable beliefs, because that's the nature of Christianity. So it's very, very difficult. And Christianity is not one set of views. It's not one set of views of what constitutes God, what constitutes religion, how the world works, how God functions within that, what God's actions or modus operandi is. And so it's very difficult for me to give you some kind of killer defeater for the idea of Christianity, because something which would attack some versions, some Christianities, doesn't have the same impact on other Christianities. But let me give you the one that I'd probably go for here. And I know you'll have an immediate objection, but I'll deal with that. And that would be evolutionary biology, adaptation and physiology. And I know your immediate reaction is going to be, well, we're not all creationists. And I'll take that on board, but let me unwind this. So I think that when you look at all the things that's involved with evolutionary biology and what adaptation explains, which something other than adaptation really struggles to deal with, sort of at the genetic level, synonymous substitutions, I suppose, endogenous retroviruses, unitary pseudogenes, things like you've got half of your olfactory genes, you've got them, but they don't work. Things such as that, when you look at the physiology of the body and all the ways that it's like, I mean, my wife has just done a course on sports massage therapy, and throughout that, there were so many parts of the body, new things that were new to me, on top of all the examples I'd had before, where you think that's clearly an adaptation as a result of an evolutionary process. You wouldn't start it from scratch in that way. So I think when you look at all those things, you arrive at a situation where I think you, as a Christian, it's not a defeater for your Christianity, but you've really got to accept that wholesale. Otherwise, you've got some really, really difficult things to explain. As Ken Miller, I don't know if you're familiar with Ken Miller. Of course, he was part of the Dover Kitzmiller trial. He became, I suppose, a bit of a celebrity in circles involving sort of YouTube atheism and Christianity. There's his book Finding Darwin's God from the time, a really good read. A scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution. And he's a Catholic biologist, and he was like the star witness for the sort of evolution side, the science side there. And as he said, his God is not a deceptive God. He said you'll almost have to believe that God has set out to make it look like evolution has happened. All you can do time and time again is just shrug your shoulders and say, well, God must just have decided to do it that way. That's about as far as your explanation can go.
And lo and behold, the centromere that is inactivated corresponds to chimp chromosome 13. It's there. It's testable. It confirms the prediction of evolution. How would intelligent design explain this? Only one way, by shrugging and saying, that's the way the designer made it. No reason, no rhyme. Presumably there's a designer who designed human chromosome number 2 to make it look as if it was formed by the fusion from a private ancestor. I'm a Roman Catholic, I'm a theist. In the broadest sense, I would say I believe in a designer, but you know what? I don't believe in a deceptive one. I don't believe in one who would do this to try to fool us. And therefore, I think this is authentic, and it tells us something about our ancestry.
So the point of me saying that, and I'll mention Ken Miller again in a minute, but the point of me saying that is not to suggest that the modern evolutionary synthesis is a defeat of a Christianity, because it isn't. It's another thing. It's another one of those things that Christianity has splendidly just warped itself around and accepted. Like I said, there's virtually nothing that I can imagine that Christianity wouldn't just wrap itself around and say, well, yeah, okay, we'll just incorporate that and carry on as if nothing's changed. But there is a problem here with regard to this, is that if you accept that then, so you accept this modern form of Christianity that fully accepts that evolution has taken place, that effectively, other than maybe some supernatural events and Jesus and a few other bits, that God has done nothing for several 100 million years. He has just allowed it to happen, as Ken Miller said, that effectively God didn't try and create us. He's tried to create some sentient agents that are intelligent enough to sort of understand his existence and what a God could be and have a relationship with him several 100 million years down the line. So he's lit the blue torch paper and then just allowed it to happen. The problem with that and that evolutionary process and adaptation is that I don't see how you fit an immaterial, immortal component that survives our death into that. And that is something that I don't think Christianity can jettison. So much of Christianity is dependent upon that. The whole business of salvation, of being responsible for our actions and having to answer for them, the business of grace and accepting God, the business effectively of reparations, right? If you were, is it the story of Job where sort of some of his family is killed to test him? Well, what about his family? Like, I mean, did they deserve that? Well, that doesn't matter, because sort of it'll all be made up for in an afterlife. You know, babies are sometimes born with cancer, leading short, horrible, painful lives. Babies are born sometimes with no skin. They have a condition where they actually don't grow skin, and they lead horrible, painful, sometimes mercifully short lives, sometimes not, but that are agony all the way through. And the sort of Christian response to that is, well, it doesn't matter because it all comes out in the wash in the afterlife. I don't think that's something that you can abandon. That's the one thing as a Christian you can't abandon. So you have to have something that reflects us, that would have to have some responsibility for our actions. The soul, whatever that may be, okay, and we can look at that in a sort of bigger sense, it has to be responsible for actions. It cannot simply be a passive observer, right? I decide to murder somebody, and the soul's just sat there going, oh, I don't think that's a good idea. You know, I'm going to end up going to hell for that, right? But it can't do anything about it. Obviously, that's not something that could sort of stand trial on my behalf. So it's got to have some interaction with us, and this brings a world of problems, I think, that are hard for Christianity to get away from. The first is, I suppose, it's the interaction detection problem, which is that if this component, it has to be able, it may be immaterial, it may be supernatural, spooky stuff that we can't detect, but to interact with our brain, that means it interacts with the material world. It's interacting with the same material stuff that our machines are made out of, that our detectors are made out of, and yet mysteriously it's entirely undetectable. It cannot remain in the realm of undetectability and interact with the material world without being detectable by the material world, without being culpable to the first law of thermodynamics and the conservation of energy, and we don't see the signatures of any of this. If it's affecting our material brains, where are the signatures for that? And also, of course, this whole business of ensoulment. And again, Christianity is very amorphous, and there's these huge different ideas. Only humans have a soul, or humans have a soul, all life has a soul, or all life has a soul, but the human soul is different to all the other souls. There has to be a point whereupon either ensoulment began or ensoulment changed in a way that is fundamental, that makes the human soul culpable and responsible and worthy of going to a heaven versus those animals that aren't. And that is a big problem. And I talked about Ken Miller, and I emailed Ken Miller about this back in 2013, and wonderfully he responded to me. I don't like to betray people's sort of private correspondence, so I won't say that, but I found his response profoundly sort of unedifying, really. And effectively what it boiled down to is that he said, well, one of them's a matter of science and the other's a matter of my faith. But the point of what I was emailing him to say was, this is something that surely you have to resolve. You can't just compartmentalize and say, well, I'm not going to try and join these two things together. Because what you have is effectively an evolved organism that is that the material brain is functionally responsible for the decisions, for the actions and inactions of that individual. So if we have a soul, for example, and a chimpanzee doesn't, if that's where it's going to be, then we had a common ancestor that didn't, and that common ancestor that didn't had a functional brain that was responsible for its actions. Think about what happens when you then ensoul one lineage, our lineage. There's something else is now controlling or having a say in the actions of that individual. That's going to require a major rewiring of the brain, isn't it? Because otherwise you've got this conflict of interests. The physical brain is trying to get you to do one thing and the soul is stopping you doing it. We don't see that rewiring of the brain. It just looks as if it never happened, right? Our brains appear to be more complicated than those of other primates. If we have a soul that is doing some of the heavy lifting, why haven't we got a simpler brain? I mean, that would be a wonderful evidence for God, wouldn't it? If our behaviours and our intellect and our cognitive capacity and everything was so much greater than other primates, and yet our brains were physically simpler, that would be pretty impressive. But actually it looks like we've got the brain that we need for the material brain to do the job. But if all you've got is that material brain that we know just rots away when you die, then there is nothing to survive your death. So you've got this whole process of how you would ensoul a physical brain that is perfectly adapted for the job it is doing without, quite frankly, fucking it up from doing the job that it's doing and creating all manner of conflicts. And of course, brains alter. My human brain is different from a human brain from 500,000 or 600,000 years ago, but souls aren't evolving because souls aren't a part of that adaptation process. God is imbuing fresh souls in each individual. But the same soul isn't going to work today as would work 500,000 years ago. I don't think Christianity does even it doesn't even attempt to address these issues. This is one thing that I think this answer is going to be a lot longer than the other 9 answers. But this is a really important question, I think, because I think this is the one thing that Christianity can't, apart from Jesus Christ being the Jewish Messiah, which is kind of definitionally fundamental. But this is the one thing that I think Christianity cannot jettison now. It is too wedded to this idea, too much rides on this idea that there is a component that survives our material death, but I do not see how you can function that into a well-adapted evolutionary framework and a creature within that framework. Okay, that would be the one for me.
If your definition of atheism is merely that it's a lack of belief in God and you're just waiting to be convinced, but then you speak of him as though he's in some way synonymous with Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, or fairies, doesn't that at least send the message to your listeners that you actually believe that there is no God? After all, these are entities and beings that you likely believe do not exist. And if your response is that you merely lack a belief in Santa Claus and don't actively believe that he does not exist, doesn't that sound a little disingenuous, honestly?
Okay, so I think we need to differentiate two things, and one is the definition of atheist, and two is the idea of a self-affirming atheist, and that's somebody who says, I know what an atheist is, I know what a theist is, I know what a deity is, and I can affirm that I'm an atheist. That's a different thing, I think. And in my view, right, you can be an atheist without being a self-affirming atheist. You could be an atheist without even having considered the concept of a deity, however unlikely that may be in our society such as it is. If you were to come across somebody who'd never even considered the concept, maybe come across an uncontacted tribe that just did not have a concept of a supernatural agent that's more powerful than we are and that in some ways governs our lives, okay, I think you would regard them as an atheistic tribe. You wouldn't say, well, they're not atheistic because they've never even considered it. That doesn't really make sense in the way that we label things, do they? It's like if you're a non-Jew, you're a Gentile. You don't have to be aware of Judaism and to have considered the ramifications of it to be a Gentile or something like that. So I think that's kind of a reasonable position. I accept what Braxton is saying here because, to some degree, because not in terms of the definition of atheist, but in terms of the people that he's come across, in that if you talk about atheism and religion and theism and you talk about your atheism, you are a self-affirming atheist. So almost to have got to that point, you have to be more than the minimal requirements to be an atheist, because you have to have considered these concepts of atheism, theism, what a deity entails, etc., etc. And therefore, there has to have been some kind of active rejection of those concepts, or at least evaluation of the concepts of a deity being responsible for things in our world versus a deity not being responsible for those things in our world. So I think then just to sit behind this sort of cloak of atheism and say it's just a lack of belief in God is a little bit disingenuous. The same as if Braxton was to do the same thing with theism and not substantiate any of the beliefs he actually holds as a Christian, that extra crap ton of baggage that's involved there, and just say, I'm only a theist, all that means is I believe in a deity. Right, that would be a little bit disingenuous, I think. So I have some sympathy there.
When atheism becomes a part of someone's worldview, they typically change their positions on other issues like abortion, sexual morality, and a number of other things. I actually have several videos of well-known atheists saying that there's nothing wrong with prostitution, that they hope their children don't save themselves until marriage, and that sex workers should be put up on a pedestal no different than the military. I didn't use those here because I didn't want to seem combative to individuals, specifically the individuals who made those statements. But even if you didn't become an atheist just so you could sin, and I believe you, do you at least understand why those moves could send that message to people who might say that to you?
Okay, so first let me say, before I actually address the question, there's a wonderful bit that Braxton does there, where he does the equivalent of me saying, that well, listen, I've known Christians who have laughed at the idea of people burning in hell and the fact that they're not going to go to hell whilst other people are. But I'm not going to mention it because that might seem a little bit confrontational and I don't want to give that impression. I've just mentioned it. Right? He gives about 4 examples of things atheists are going to say and then says, but I'm kind of not going to mention them, when he just did. This wasn't a live video that he made, a sort of live stream. It was a pre-recorded video. If you don't want to mention those things, you don't mention them. But don't play this game where you want to mention them and then say, but I'm not going to mention them, to get out of the fact that you've just mentioned them. I'm sorry, mate. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work that way. But I understand the point that he's trying to say here is that effectively there is this fact that if there are certain things that as a Christian you regard as sinful, if you wanted to do them, then you may have a vested interest in not being a Christian so that you could do them. Of course, that kind of suggests that, the mind boggles why a Christian, if you actually were a Christian to begin with and actually believed in God, right? Well, that just doesn't make any sense, does it? It's like if Mike Tyson is stood in front of me, right, and I believe that going, wow, Mike Tyson, you wanker, is going to result in him smashing me in the nose and breaking my nose and breaking my face open, right? If that's what I genuinely believe, I'm not going to... how can I then say, well, I don't really want to believe that because I want to be able to go, wow, Mike Tyson, you wanker, right? Without him doing it. So I'm just going to stop believing it, right? The mind boggles, really. I would say with regard to that it is probably true that for some people who call themselves Christians, some of the sin and moral bullshit, quite frankly, is inconvenient to them. And so they do one of two things. They either modify their Christianity, which is what most Christians have done for the past 2,000 years, so that wonderfully the objective morals of God is whatever they particularly wanted it to be. Let's be frank. That's what societies have done, and that's what in many cases individuals have done, or they just abandon the whole thing. But really, they probably didn't properly believe it anyway, because if you genuinely believe that having sex before marriage or doing some of these other things is going to lead to you spending an eternity in hell, whatever that entails, it's not great, is it, right? It's not going to be good. If you genuinely believe that, you're not going to drop it, are you? Right? I mean, I wouldn't sin if I genuinely believed that. I do all the right things. I do whatever God said. However hideous it appeared to be, I just go along with it. Right? So it just doesn't make any sense. But I think in reality there are a lot of Christians by name who don't really believe most of it. And so maybe that then plays in that they do drop their pretenses of religion because it's kind of inconvenient to just go along with it for the cultural sake of it, when it's precluding them from doing things or holding opinions that they genuinely hold or genuinely wish to do. And also the claim that you make, Braxton, is very much a two-way street. Because one of the oft-cited claims for Christianity's success over the years is the fact that salvation is through grace, not works, right? And so it really doesn't matter what terrible shit you've done over the years, because all you need to do is sort of genuinely ask for forgiveness and worship God and Jesus and all this lot, and all is forgiven. I saw a wonderful documentary with a guy called Louis Theroux, where he went into one of these prisons and he was talking to some sort of some prisoners, very, very religious prisoners, who were constantly trying to convert other prisoners. This was in one of these mega high security prisons in the United States where they're all sort of mass murderers and stuff. And this guy was saying to Louis Theroux what a wonderful environment it is for converting people to Christianity, because the unique selling point of Christianity is it doesn't matter what terrible shit you've done, right? You're just forgiven for it. What a wonderful selling point that is for a mass murderer. Don't worry, son. Don't worry what you've done. All you need to do is accept Jesus into your life, and that's all forgiven. And you're back in God's good books and you go to heaven. But if you don't do that, it doesn't even matter if you haven't murdered a single person, because we're all born awash with sin anyway, right? And God can't abide even the slightest bit of sin, so we're all sinful, so it doesn't really matter whether what you've done's good or bad anyway. What matters is whether you've asked for forgiveness, whether you've asked for salvation. So the point I'm making here is you can make this argument of convenience either way. I think the mind boggles to me either way. If you're somebody who doesn't think a God exists, how you convince yourself a God exists out of convenience, I don't know. If you genuinely believe that God exists, I don't know how you would convince yourself that it doesn't out of convenience. But then I'm not everybody.
If it's a lack of belief sort of atheism, what is it? Is it 50-50, 60-40, 75-25? And at what point do you feel disingenuous saying that you merely lack a belief, as opposed to leaning towards, I believe that God does not exist?
Okay, well, I don't really think that's a very coherent question, because when you're talking about saying, well, is it 80-20, 60-40 or whatever, then I think you're going beyond the lack of belief, because then you're talking about a consideration of the evidence for or against, and saying 60% of it is against God existing, 40% is for him existing, so the preponderance of evidence is this way, and that's why I hold the position that I do. Whereas I think a lack of belief is a slightly different thing. I described this in a video a couple of years ago, And immediately that I say this to you, your belief, the sort of propositional, you'll start to hold a propositional attitude to what I'm talking about. Whereas at the moment you hold a lack of a belief for this thing based not upon a propositional attitude, but based upon ignorance. So if I talk to you, this was the example I gave a couple of years ago, and said that you have a lack of belief in goblin slugs. Right, and a goblin slug, let me explain the concept to you. It has the body of a slug, but it has the head of a goblin. Okay, and it sort of slithers along on a slime trail the way that a slug does, and it's about 8 foot long. Okay, so I think you lacked a belief in goblin slugs all your life, right? But it wasn't based upon a preponderance of evidence. It was based upon simply an ignorance of the concept. You had the ability to conceptualize a goblin slug, but the idea had never occurred to you. You still don't have a belief in goblin slugs, but I would suggest now it is a more active disbelief, based upon probably on the fact, which is effectively what I think the position is for most atheists, the fact that you feel that if goblin slugs did exist, you'd know a bit more about goblin slugs by now, right? You'd have watched one of these documentaries with David Attenborough talking about the majestic goblin slug sliming its way across the swamps of South America or something. And the fact that you haven't seen that, and the fact that you do not regard goblins as fitting into the sort of taxonomic evolutionary trees of our planet, makes all these things add together. It's a kind of lack of evidence, if you like, that then forms an active position that you're now taking on goblin slugs. But you've always been a goblin sluggist, but you just didn't know it. You were never self-affirming goblin sluggist, but I would have labelled you externally a goblin sluggist. Okay, I think that's it for that one.
Now, I know we've all got our talking points, but I want you to struggle to be as sincere with yourself as you can right now. Doesn't it bother you a little bit that when we come to talk about the origins of the universe, and if there's a multiverse, the origin of that too, that the only real options you've got besides God is a past infinite universe, which is impossible, or the universe coming to exist uncaused out of nothing, or something far less clear than even those? It seems that for any worldview that includes atheism, there's a massive blind spot when it comes to the origin of the universe. And all the attempts to try and circumvent that problem seem desperate and at least far less likely than theism. My question isn't just what do you typically say about this, because I'm well aware of the responses. My question is simply this: when you step away from the debate mode that it's so easy for us all to get into online, doesn't this issue destabilize you a little bit? It seems to fit really poorly with any worldview that includes atheism.
Okay, so that's a good question. I always like this question or versions of it. And I suppose it's an appeal to mind-bogglingness, a bit like the more sort of properly labelled philosophical appeal to incredulity or personal incredulity, but mind-bogglingness in this case. The problem is that I think that you are standing this on the basis that the mind-bogglingness is one-sided, whereas I don't think that is the case. I think the case is that however the universe came about, to us it will appear mind-boggling. And to help me with this, I'm going to be a little bit lazy and link to a piece of footage of Dan Dennett responding to William Lane Craig. I say it's lazy, that's because I've played this clip in a video once before, but it's just worth listening to this minute or so of what Dan Dennett has to say.
Is he takes our everyday intuitions, our gut feelings about what's plausible, what's counterintuitive, what couldn't possibly be true, and he cantilevers them out into territory where they've never been tested in cosmology, where whatever the truth is, it's mind-boggling. So we know in advance that whatever the truth is, it's going to be jaw-droppingly implausible and counterintuitive in one way or another. The simplest expression of this, I think, was due to the late Philip Morrison, who pointed out, perhaps we are alone in the universe. Perhaps there's no other planet in the whole universe that has intelligent life on it. Or perhaps that's not true. Both alternatives are mind-boggling. The hypothesis that we're alone is mind-boggling. The hypothesis that we're not alone is mind-boggling. So you can't use mind-bogglingness as your litmus test. The truth is going to be very hard to believe. And some of our home truths are going to have to be abandoned. We already know this from quantum physics. We already know this from Einstein.
So the example Dennett gives there is from Philip Morrison, who talks about life on planets. But there's a sort of a readily available equivalent here, I think, which is that either the universe is temporally infinite in the past, it's always existed, which is mind-boggling, or the universe is not temporally infinite in the past. That there was a time in the past when the universe was created. Before that time, space didn't exist. Time itself didn't exist. An almost impossible idea for our brains to wrap our heads around. It is mind-boggling. And those are the logical possibilities. It either always existed or it didn't. And introducing a deity into the mix doesn't expand on those logical possibilities. It still has to be one of those two options. So it is still going to be mind-boggling. So this is the thing. I will agree with you that all the non-religious explanations for the origin of the universe are mind-boggling. They just don't make sense to us, but neither do the religious ones. The religious ones fare no better. And I think that in many ways the religious ones, the typically Christian ones, introduce their own subset of mind-boggling things. After all, as I understand, the conventional thinking is that your God has infinite wisdom and yet at the same time is simplicity itself, which is about as counterintuitive as anything I can think of. Our understanding is the more wise something becomes, the more knowledgeable, the more intellectual it becomes, the more complex it has to be. The idea that something could be the ultimate of simplicity and yet be omniscient is, I propose, right from the off, mind-boggling. And the alternatives that you have with regards to God and his creation of the universe is either he does not sit within our temporality, of course he could not do if he created it, is that either he sits within his own dimensions and temporal realm, that he's a temporal being, but that there is like another temporal dimension, a dimension of time that exists outside of ours, which is mind-boggling. And just an insertion here to say that as well, it also reintroduces all the issues that you had with a temporal regress as well. You still need to explain, does his temporal realm go infinitely back in the past? And if not, then what? Or he is an entirely atemporal agent that effectively he does such things as thought, action, and creation, things which we regard as intrinsically temporal, things which we regard as ordered along a dimension of time, and yet he orders them along a dimension of time without there being a dimension of time for him to order them along. I propose that that is probably the most mind-boggling suggestion of them all. That's not to suggest that it's wrong, because all I can offer you with regard to this particular question is other things of which are mind-boggling. Right, so I don't think that this is a very fertile territory for anybody to score any points over anybody else here. If I can paraphrase a very famous concern in this area, it's mind-bogglingness all the way down.
Of the arguments for God's existence, is there one that to you seems more interesting than the rest? Is there one that for you actually does weigh in favor of theism? Which one?
Oh dear, do I have to answer this one? I don't know whether this is a question I want to answer really. It's a bit awkward to admit this one, and I don't know whether this is one I've ever really gone into on film. So in terms of the sort of rational, logical and scientific arguments, I don't really think there are any that washes for me. But there is sort of arguments, or there may be not arguments, but trains of thought that flatter my own perceptions of myself, I suppose, or my own internal sense of grandiosity, that I just can't imagine not existing. It just seems, like I say, I almost cringe to say it, but I almost feel like I'm too special not to exist anymore. How can a universe exist that would allow me not to exist anymore? That sounds terribly immodest, doesn't it? And even as I'm saying it, I'm thinking, how does that come across? But I doubt I'm the only person who thinks like that. It's probably part of our sort of evolutionary adaptation to sort of avoid death, that I'm trying to appease that and figure some way in which I can kind of continue existing indefinitely, that it's just hard for my brain to pass the idea of my own non-existence. But there are times definitely where I feel like that, where I find it hard to comprehend the idea of me not existing. And in those times my brain does grapple, trying to find, is there some way, is there some logical thing that could lead me to believe or presume that there is some way that I could survive my material demise. The logical side of me always takes over and arrives at a no, which is always somewhat depressing at the time, I must admit. But I would say that is as good as it gets. It's not an argument, it's not a religious argument, but it's an emotional appeal. An emotional tug that sort of flatters my own sense of personal grandiosity. And I think most humans have that sense of personal grandiosity. It's not necessarily that we think we're better than everybody else, but that we somehow feel that we're so special. That we're so special as a sort of sentient, self-aware agent, that how could we possibly not continue to exist?
Most atheists I've met humbly admit that they don't think they can have absolute certainty about much of anything. But what they want from the Christian is a demonstration that God exists, or that Christianity is true. Well, when we offer the reasons to believe that we do have, those are typically deemed not good enough. So what sort of evidence, if any, would be enough to convince you? Do you know? And since it's often a conversation stopper, let's take experimental reproducibility off the table, since that's not even always necessary for science.
You know, I could probably reasonably ask Braxton exactly the same question, but with regards to any other religion, and then the answer that he gives to that, there's his answer, right, if he wants an answer. But I probably ought to do more than that. I think the fact that he asks the question implies that he feels that somehow we ought to be impressed by the evidence that is available, and that he's somewhat mystified that we're not. And yet the story of Christianity, of theology, of Christian philosophy, is of tens of thousands of hours invested in trying to explain away the problem of divine hiddenness. Right? If Christians can admit that it's a problem, and a problem that they've had to invest so much time in trying to explain away, then why would anybody be mystified that atheists aren't particularly convinced by what they see? Indeed, there are many people of great faith, of immense faith, of celebrated faith within Christianity who have had crises of confidence because God's most amazing quality appears to be his ability to do absolutely nothing, to not appear, right, to not get involved, to not do the things that you would expect him to do, to appear just as if he doesn't exist, quite honestly. And that is something that Christians have spent a lot of time trying to explain away. And the bit that really boggles my mind in this particular instance is that apparently, this is what Christians have told me, that God actually, it's a bit of a big deal to him, is this moral thing, right? Morals are a bit of a big deal to God. right? And that he has this kind of set of timeless, objective moral absolutes that we all need to abide by, right? We simply must obey them. He just wants to have a relationship with us. He wants to invite us into heaven, but he can't stand sin, even the tiniest little bit, right? And so we need to abide by these standards. But bizarrely, even Christians can't agree on what they are. Subjects like, modern subjects like abortion, like homosexuality, like contraception. Is it okay to wear a condom, or isn't it? There's people dying in Africa because the Catholic Church doesn't like the idea of people wearing condoms. Other religious denominations say that's an absolute load of hogwash, right? Christians themselves. So there's no way that as a Christian you can say, no, all these objective moral values are absolutely clear, right? And I can tell you exactly what they are, because there will be more Christians who disagree with you than agree with you. If Christians cannot decide, what hope for the rest of us? Surely that has to tell you that there's a bit of an information gap here. If this is so important to God, right, why doesn't he just tell us? Why is it all so fucking cryptic? Right? Why do we have to interpret scripture for 2,000 years ago that was written in a different language that doesn't spell out exactly what is the situation here, what is the situation there, what is the situation there, so we can all just understand what these objective moral values are, and we can all just, if we want to live by them, if we want to do what God says, at least we know what it is that we've got to do and what it is that we shouldn't do, rather than playing this ludicrous guessing game. Right, would God really want that to happen? I mean, let me just give you an alternative here, right? Because that's what we're talking about. Alternative worldviews, alternative perspectives, and what best fits the evidence. How about this alternative perspective, which is that God doesn't actually exist, and the reason that he doesn't reveal himself and spell out exactly what his objective moral values are is that he doesn't exist, ergo doesn't have any objective moral values to spell out to us. How about that?
To what extent did social and moral issues start you down the path toward your atheism? That is to say, the typical Christian or religious views on sexuality, gender, rights, and acts and commands of God in the Old Testament. It seems that many deconversion stories online begin with, or at least include, LGBT issues, purity culture, or hell as instrumental in the deconversion process. It strikes me that what should matter most is the truth and not what we might prefer that the truth were. I honestly wonder how much those issues and ones like them motivate the deconversion rather than all this talk about evidence.
Well, I mean, I can't really speak for that. I was never deconverted. I was never religious. I was brought up in a non-religious family. My father was the person that I talked to about these things. He regarded himself as an agnostic. He always said that you should try and keep an open mind. Personally, I would say he was an atheist, but he was from a time when sort of people used the term agnostic more, when today they'd maybe be more comfy using the term atheist. But I told him when I was 6, we had lots of discussions about science. I don't think social issues played any part in it whatsoever. It was mainly, even as a kid, I was like fascinated by science, and I told him at 6 years old that I didn't think that God existed. At 6 years old. My son's 5, actually. He said the same thing a few months ago, and we've had a similar kind of conversation. So he's got one up on me again there. But, a little sod. But, yeah, so that's what happened. And even then, my father asked me why I thought what I thought. And then he said, well, that's fine. And it's a decision you've got to, it's one of these questions in life you need to work out for yourself. But he said, keep an open mind to all the arguments. And then as I grew up, we had lots and lots of discussions about it, about science and the universe and how the universe could have begun and what it would mean to have a sort of a divine moral agent and all these different things. We'd start to get into some of those other things. But the actual specific social concerns and all that was something that we hardly really ever discussed. They're things that I've discussed really as I sort of got into my 30s, I think, and then started to consider the ramifications of religion with regards to them. It was much more of a sort of academic, philosophical and scientific subject for me when I was in those more formative years.
Can you name the last 3 academic books you read by theists on the subject? How long ago did you read them? Or is most of your understanding of apologetics and atheism from non-scholarly internet sources, pop-level books, and, let's face it, YouTube videos? And be honest with yourself about this. Anyone can Google up a list of books and paste them in the comments section. But I want to know, are you getting the best from the other side?
Okay, so I don't want this to degenerate into just a large sort of book list or something like that. And I don't really know what the other side is necessarily with regard to this, because some of the scholarly sources are not necessarily theological sources, are not necessarily sources of people who believe in God. They are some of the scholarly sources. Some of the scholarly sources are. So I just dragged up a few books from downstairs. Maybe the one that I should start with is the one that I didn't finish, which was the last one that I attempted reading, was Reasonable Faith from William Lane Craig, and I got just under halfway through that one. And then just sort of other things took over, and I admit I never actually got to finish that. The first one that I read was this. It's a hell of a work, this was. I read this about 12 or 13 years ago. And it's got like 2,500 footnote references. There must be about 5,000 passages, different quotes from passages of the Bible. It's quite an astonishing book, but clearly written from somebody who was sort of, I suppose you could say, antagonistic towards Christian thought, but a very interesting book nonetheless. Richard Elliott Friedman, who wrote the Bible, of course, the documentary hypothesis is something he's famous for. So he's looking at those books of the Torah and how they were written and and the sort of situation in which they were written. Another good book. The lengths you have to go to source some of these as a hardback nowadays. Israel Finkelstein, of course, the Israeli archaeologist, biblical archaeologist, the Bible Unearthed, looking at some of the historical context of the Bible and what we can actually find from digging through the kind of sites where the Israelites, Canaanites were living. Very, very interesting stuff. From a more sort of religious perspective, right? People who actually believe as Christians or Jews. Some other examples, that's like Alvin Plantinga. I think he's about as mad as a box of frogs, to be honest, but where the conflict really lies, I read all of that. Francis S. Collins, The Language of God, of course, he was the head of the Human Genome Project and a Christian. We've talked about the Ken Miller one, A Similar Circumstance. Jonathan Sacks, the chief rabbi of Great Britain, The Great Partnership. I've got the Jewish Study Bible downstairs, which is a great book because it's not just for every section of the Old Testament, the Tanakh. There are footnotes explaining about it, the historical context of it, different interpretations of it, and then there are a series of essays which are fascinating in the back. 100, 200 pages of essays in the back. All about the way the Bible was written in the historical context and all that kind of thing. And that is from the Jewish Publication Society, right? That's like leading authority on Jewish and Christian, of course, scripture, but part of Christian scripture, the Old Testament. So there's that. But what I would say is maybe the thing that's had the biggest impact on me wasn't a book list. It wasn't a book. But it was a very, very scholarly source, or couples of sources. If you navigate yourself to Open Yale courses, this is from Yale University, they have made available entire courses at the university level. And there are two courses. Those two courses combined amount to 50 45-minute lectures. 26 on the New Testament, 24 on the Old Testament. I'll show you on screen what the different sessions involve. And let me read you the New Testament one. This course provides a historical study of the origins of Christianity by analysing the literature of the earliest Christian movements in historical context, concentrating on the New Testament. Although theological themes will occupy much of our attention, the course does not attempt a theological appropriation of the New Testament as scripture. Rather, the importance of the New Testament and other early Christian documents as ancient literature and as sources for historical study will be emphasised. A central organising theme of the course will focus on the differences within early Christianity, Christianities. That's Professor Dale Martin running that course. And then a 24-session course Introduction to the Old Testament Hebrew Bible from Professor Christine Hayes. This course examines the Old Testament as an expression of the religious life and thoughts of ancient Israel and a foundational document of Western civilization. A wide range of methodologies, including source criticism and the historical critical school, tradition criticism, redaction criticism, and literary and canonical approaches are applied to the study interpretation of the Bible. Special emphasis is placed on the Bible against the backdrop of its historical and cultural setting in the ancient Near East. I cannot recommend these two courses more than to say that listen to them. You don't need to watch them. You can listen to them on an MP3 as you're going about doing other things, because it's not like there's a lot of sort of chalkboard or OHP work or PowerPoint work. So you can listen to them. They are absolutely fascinating to such an extent that I have listened to both courses all the way through twice each and gone back to some of the episodes subsequently and re-listened to parts of them. They are courses that I would recommend whether you are a Christian, whether you're an atheist, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Hindu, anybody who's got a passing interest in any of these subjects. I think they are two very, very worthwhile courses. Okay, I don't really know if that answers your question. I certainly haven't tried to source most of my data just off what people on YouTube say, if that's the implication.
Let's finish with a pretty common one. If you found out today to your satisfaction that Christianity were true, would you accept God's authority, repent of your sins, and trust Jesus as your king?
Well, I mean, if I found out that Christianity was true, then kind of how could I not? Why would I not? I mean, you know, it's like if you look out the window and it's raining, on what grounds would you want to shout at the window it's not raining? I mean, if something leads you to believe without a shred of personal doubt that something is true, then why would you want to claim that it wasn't true? I don't know. There are some atheists who try and play the Billy Big Bollocks card with regard to this and say, well, if God exists, I'd tell him to go F it off. You know, I'd tell him, right, that's I don't know. I never know where that comes from. Right, that kind of false courage. There are real life dictators, tyrants, terrible, terrible people on earth who hold people, you know, they will torture you. They will torture your family. They will watch your family. Make you watch your family be tortured unless you do what they say, and people do what they say. But the threats that they can hold over you are finite, right? If they torture you too much, you die. If they don't torture you too much, well, you're going to die anyway, right? The amount that they can do to you is finite. As I understand it, the punishment for not doing what God wants you to do is not a finite punishment. It's far worse. It's an infinite. The punishment just goes on forever. It never ends. At least in the view of some Christians, right? And a sort of more traditional Christian view. It's beyond horrific. People don't stand up to these tyrants. They give in. They'll commit atrocities themselves if they need to, unless they think that they can just quickly die, have a quick bullet to the brain or whatever. Some people are courageous enough for that. The idea, you've either got to be sort of naive or have zero imagination to really understand what's at stake here, to think that you would face down the Christian God and not do exactly what he told you to do. I can tell you, right, and I don't say this without any guilt or feeling that I should have to apologize for this. I would do exactly what he told me to do. That includes commit atrocities. If he told me to do it, because I would be so fearful, so utterly fearful for the penalty of not doing that. I could maybe take some torture. I could maybe take being killed, my life ceasing to exist. But the idea of an infinite period of punishment, of torture, is too scary, really. So yeah, I would accept anything, pretty much. I would accept anything to save my own bacon, if that was the case. Any amount of worshipping, any deed, anything like that. Okay, so those are the answers to the 10 questions. I'll obviously forward this to Braxton Hunter. It's a great name, that. I'll forward this to Braxton and see what he has to say. For those of you who watched this video, always interested to know what you think about your answers to this. I'm sure you will furnish me with your answers as well. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.